What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. Have you picked up your copy of Beyond UX Design, Master Your Craft Beyond Pixels and Prototypes in paperback yet? Unlock the secrets of UX success and learn all the things I didn't teach you in school. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/book to learn more. This week's episode is brought to you by Jeff White and his UX Storytelling Toolkit. Now, lots of people talk about the importance of storytelling, but Jeff brings actionable clarity to the storytelling, and he shows you exactly how to do it. He breaks down different real-world scenarios like how to use storytelling methods to present your work to clients and stakeholders, how to craft a better case study, and how to prep for job interviews. And I love Jeff's approach to storytelling here. It's not your simple once-upon-a-time kind of stuff. And since you're an amazing listener, I know this course will help you out so much. I'm stoked to get everybody listening a 10% discount if you use the code BeyondUX when you check out. So head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/storytelling and use the code BeyondUX to get 10% off Jeff's course. So learn some incredible techniques to influence your team and advance your UX career. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, and Adina for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. You can get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing here, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then for the love of God, tell your mom and them about it. Something that a lot of people run into in their career early on is this idea of giant corporate environments. They hate it and they want to get out and they want to just work at a startup. And often that means finding a startup that's got no designers and you become the founding designer. Sometimes founding designer is often masked as just the only designer on the team. And there's a difference there between founding designer and only designer. And I am so excited to have Taylor Palmer on today to talk about this. Taylor is an early stage product designer who's been designing for startups for the last 10 years, from seed stage to unicorn status. He has a degree in graphic design and is self-taught in front-end development. He's a Data 3, currently living in Minneapolis, and is a big sci-fi fantasy nerd. We talked a little bit about his Ornithopter Lego set a little bit ago. So I'm so excited to have Taylor on. You probably know him as the founder of UX Tools, but you might also know him from LinkedIn and other places. Taylor, welcome to Beyond UX Design. I'm so excited to have you on. How's it going?
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Really happy to be here. How are you doing?
I am doing good. I don't know if you could, we don't talk all that often, so you might not know, but I'm a little congested. My kids, as Data 3, my kids got something at school, and I've been taking cold medicine for the last couple of days. But luckily, I haven't gotten anything, but it's all up here. There's this stuff up here, but...
You mentioned Data 3 in the intro, and that comes with the title. We can nerd out about this later, but I've actually got a sick calendar now. It happens so frequently that I'm actually tracking. Some epidemiologist in the future is going to thank me for that treasure trove of data. But yeah, that's another side project of mine.
That's so fascinating, dude. What are you going to do with that? Is that something you're going to do? Something, I assume?
I think that's mostly to keep myself sane, so that when I tell people how sick we are and they don't believe me, I have some data to back it up. Because
look at the proof. I've got
unreal.
It right here.
Yeah.
I love it, man. All right, so I know we talked a little bit about that bio, but you've done a whole lot of stuff. The bio that you provided, I think, was maybe a little humble, but I think you've done a lot of really cool stuff, and I can't think of a better person to talk about being a founding designer than you. You've done a lot of awesome stuff. Tell us a little bit about you for anybody who isn't familiar with you out there, and then we'll kick it off, man.
Yeah, maybe I can fill in a couple of the gaps there. True, I've been designing for startups for 10 years. Being self-taught in front-end development also gave me the opportunity to have a little side quest of solopreneurship that turned into a partnership. That's when I built UX Tools, and that came with the UX Tools database where we tracked prototyping tools and all sorts of stuff over the years. Also turned into the UX Survey, where every year we'd survey 4,000 to 5,000 designers about their toolkits and share that back out with the community. So that was a really cool experience of kind of building my own business and figuring out my own product market fit and things like that. That was really great for my own learning and development as well. So it's been fun. I've always got my finger in lots of pies and always exploring lots of different stuff.
I love it, dude. So you have been in that position of being the founding designer, building a business and all those things, and you've owned the businesses, you've worked for other people who own the business, and you were the founding designer. I want to talk a little bit level set here, because it's funny when you see people on LinkedIn and they talk about, I got a job at a startup, I'm the only designer, I'm the founding designer, and they just make this up. I want to like level set this a little bit and talk about what is a founding designer and how can we compare that to a startup that just hired only designer. And people will put that, inflating their titles and stuff, make it sound all fancy, but it isn't the same thing. So talk a little bit about that if you could, and explain maybe the difference between a founding designer and some junior designer who just got a job as the only designer and says they're founding designer.
I think the title founding designer can be confusing, specifically because it has the word founding in it, but I have not been a founding team member of the startups I've worked for. And instead, founding designer usually refers to the first design hire who is responsible for developing a practice within a business and really building up a lot of the foundations and frameworks that a design team needs to succeed. And so that usually there has not been a design presence at the business yet, unless maybe one of the founders has a design background or some knowledge there and has brought some of that to the team. So that's really the role of a founding designer, is to spin up design from zero. And that's setting up research practices, design systems. I typically do quite a bit of brand as well. UI, working with engineering, product strategy, a lot of this stuff comes out as you really start to build things bare bones. And that's something I found that I really enjoy. But as you've mentioned, there can be some mixed understandings of that and some pitfalls of that as people from various backgrounds might move into that role.
Yeah. So like it sounds like the way you're explaining it then, it's a leadership role. It isn't an order taker role. It's you're coming in, you have a point of view, you have an opinion, you have a perspective. Your job is to help those people around you make the right decisions. It isn't to be an order taker.
A best case scenario, the business has arrived at a point where they recognize they can't cut it themselves, right? Because at this point, you've probably got founders spinning up landing pages and maybe doing some of the UI themselves, or maybe there's a couple engineers there that they've hired or something. And at some point, they arrived at the reality that they need design help and they want to bring in an expert. So hopefully it's a situation to let experts be experts. And now you are there to evangelize what best practices look like and bring in your experience to help that business build a successful first business and second design practice. So yes, I think leadership can have a lot of baggage to it. It does not necessarily have to be like a management role or something like that, but it is certainly an experienced role as I see it.
Experienced role. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I love that you call that out, because it's funny. I always see this on places like LinkedIn. I know you're active on social media, and so you've probably seen this too. Somebody who just graduates a boot camp, they join some startup. The startup probably doesn't have a ton of money, and so they're looking for the cheapest possible hire, which is, of course, someone with no experience. And then that person gets a job, and they end up not being successful. And have you seen that before? Is that something like you've experienced? And I'm curious, what do you have to say to like designers who might be in that position to advise them one way or another?
There are a lot of things that can go wrong with that situation. I think there are some rare instances where it goes really well. That person really catches fire and takes off and that company grows a lot. I think what probably happens more often than not is that person misses out on a lot of opportunities for mentorship, especially if they're still a junior designer. And so they haven't been able to learn from maybe the wisdom of more experienced designers or to be on a large, healthy design team. And so I think it would be difficult to successfully spin up a design practice if you have not seen one in action or you've not been a part of one. Also, yes, you mentioned title inflation and things like that can happen, right? You can call yourself Chief Design Officer of the Universe or whatever you want to call yourself. And then it can become a golden handcuffs situation where that person actually gets trapped with this kind of upside down title, and moving to another company, they will be benchmarked as a junior or mid-level, but they have some super inflated lead principal founding leadership title or something that makes it hard for them to actually continue that lateral movement.
Yeah, I love that. I always laugh when I see people on LinkedIn. I'm a junior designer, senior designer, chief design officer, executive, whatever, CEO. They started their own little company, and then a senior designer, next role, whatever. I always laugh at that. So I'm curious when you hear or when you think about the types of skill sets that are required for a founding designer role. It sounds like to me usually I assume, small teams, most likely. You're probably not going to have a budget to hire a bunch of people. I'm inferring here because I've never been a founding designer, but more of a generalist hat. You're not going to be a specialist. What's your thoughts on that? What type of skill set do you think like a founding designer need to be successful in this type of role?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe also to give your listeners some kind of company profiles to think about. The first company I was at, I was designer number 4, and there were about 80 or 90 employees. And then from there, that grew to a team of 650. And at that point, I exited. Then I was founding designer at a team of 40, then at a team of 12. I now joined at a team of 9. And so I guess it just keeps going smaller. I don't know where we go from here. 3, 2, 1. But just to give you a sense of like when those early designers might come in and what those company profiles might look like. Yes, the founding designer role and also the first couple designers I typically hire, I need to be generalists. I need them to have a wealth of experience across a lot of capabilities and across a lot of potentially industries, depending on the role. And I also need them to be willing to move into areas where they may not be specialists and just to cover a lot of bases. We've heard the term like wearing many hats. That's essentially what everyone at a startup does. So you can imagine right now I'm on a team of 30 and we're doing the work of a couple hundred people. So everybody's doing different roles and really spreading themselves across a lot of capacities. And so I think I usually look for someone who's energized by that, someone who wants to try a lot of different things and do a lot of different things, move across a lot of projects. And so that's definitely a big part of the role, is that kind of jack of all trades, generalist designer.
Yeah, I love that. I was actually going to talk about this in a little bit, but I think it actually makes sense to maybe move this up in the conversation because we're talking about now. When I think of generalists, I don't think of early career necessarily. I think of, obviously, someone early in their career, they can be learning those things. But I use this analogy of a gymnast learning to do a backflip. And my first job, actually, I wouldn't consider myself a founding designer, but my first UX design job, I joined a tiny little startup agency that built web apps and mobile apps for startups. And so I was the only designer. I worked with an engineer, a business analyst, and then another engineer. And I had no idea what I was doing as my first UX job. And I'm self-taught. So like I didn't actually even go to school for it. I'm just like reading books and things like that. And I use this analogy of learning to do a backflip, right? Like you can go on YouTube, you can read a book, you can watch videos on how to do a backflip. And you can go out in your backyard and you can try to do a backflip. And you might do the backflip. You might also land on your head and break your neck. And so I think about this a lot as an early career, joining those teams. And there's, especially like startups, there could often be a lot of money invested in this. There's a lot of money on the line. People's livelihoods are on the line, not to mention the users that are going to be using this thing, and you're designing this. And I'm curious, when you think about designers getting a job as a founding designer or the only designer on a team, when do you think people are ready? How do you know if you're a solo design gig or a founding design gig? Maybe I would say a solo design gig, maybe less of that kind of influence, and if we don't want to call it leadership, influence and knowing what's right and wrong. It takes a long time to get to that point, right? A long time, several years maybe. I'm curious, like when you advise people, talk to people, mentor other designers, how do you tell them when they're ready, or how do they know when they're ready to take on that role and not break their neck, the proverbial neck?
That's a great question. And I hadn't heard the comparison of the backflip before, but I appreciate the metaphor. And I definitely think there's a lot of wisdom there. Hopefully not with physical harm, but certainly a lot of lost money or potentially catastrophe for a business. I won't claim to be the sole expert on founding designers or to know exactly when it's right for anyone, but I'm happy to explore the topic and certainly my own journey. I think a few of the things that I needed to experience before I felt like I could successfully take a swing at a founding designer role was certainly leading projects in which I was the main, if not only, DRI, like directly responsible individual for the outcome and success of that project, and feeling like I could take that start to finish, full stop, run that project successfully, manage stakeholders, synthesize my research, hand off the UI, really do it all. And so that's a great individual contributor band of skills that need to be mastered there to be able to then go transplant that into another business and do that successfully. However, that can make for a great designer. But as a founding designer, I've also found myself exposed to hiring and building a team. So I need to bring in a couple more designers as I grow, and I need to understand how to integrate them into the business. Usually the first couple designers I'm looking for are also pretty senior as well because they have a similar profile to myself. And hiring is its own beast, right? Like reviewing portfolios, doing whatever types of exercises and different activities you might have as a part of that. Learning how to remove as much bias as you can from that process, being generally a good human, and then making sure that person is satisfied in their career as they grow with you. Big responsibility, big thing. And then the third thing I'll mention as well is process improvement. And in many cases, process implementation. If you have not been exposed to the difficulties of organizational change and what that requires, it is not a simple process. It is not easy to do. And to be able to bring, in this case, 10, 20, 30, 50 other people along to the new way of working that you're proposing is a massive skill set. There are entire industries and consultancies built just on being able to do that, to change individual processes within a business. And if you have not had a chance to try your hand at those things, or at least have visibility into those things, I think you might be out over your skis a little bit when that comes across your plate and it's your turn to do that.
I think a lot about, we talk about storytelling, obviously, as designers. And storytelling, obviously, goes with being able to be a good storyteller, goes with influence. To Jeff, we gave a shout out to his course earlier.
Right on.
People like Jeff do a really great job of helping you explain this if you aren't familiar with it yet. But it's the influence and things like that from confidence, which leads me to my next question. And this is going back to my experience as the only designer at this company. I was self-taught. And a lot of times what happens with especially young designers, Dunning-Kruger effect, right? They think they know way more than they actually know. They aren't aware of the things that they don't know. And it's funny, going back in time and looking at where I was 4 years into my career. I was at that company for 4 years. Left that company to go work at a giant multinational conglomerate that had a design team of 40, 50 people. And it wasn't until then, 4 years into my career, I actually realized I had no idea what I was doing. I had never been doing research right, talking to one or two people and just like talking about a thing. I assumed that was research. I didn't know anything about usability studies and actual ethnography and all these other things. And so I was at that peak of Mount Stupid when you look at the graph of what you think. I was right at the peak of that before I started working with the design team. And I'm curious, with confidence, the pitfall of being overconfident. And I'm just curious, like if you were thinking back to maybe your early career or even just things you would tell people that you're mentoring, I'm curious, is there a way to think about that and identify if you have a false sense of confidence and you are falling for Dunning-Kruger and you think you know more than you do, but you actually don't? How do you determine that?
I think I would be lying if I said I hadn't fallen into that at times as well, right? And I've had to eat my humble pie on occasion as well as I've moved through various organizations. And I think just as the business has had to arrive at a point where they recognize they now need a professional designer to come help them, I think that individual designer also needs to arrive at a point where they can recognize and accept their gaps as well. And so just like you described, recognizing the whole actual iceberg of user research where user interviews are just the very cap that's barely showing over the water, and there's actually this whole other world of research. I would not claim to be an expert researcher. However, I have built and delivered successful experiences that have positively impacted businesses and people. And I know that I have a toolkit that can be successful and that can work in an early stage environment. And at some point, that toolkit will start to return less and less. And at that point, I need to staff up people who are more expert in those various fields and build up that skill layer where I might be lacking. And so I think I've at least been able to do that enough where I know when I'm going to need to tap out and probably move more into player coach or specialize and build up the rest of the crew. But if you haven't successfully been able to deliver projects or build a business or do something like that, I think it would be very hard to convince a business that you're the person to help them do that as the first designer, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we can lean on some of those past experiences a little bit. But let's be honest, I think our whole industry could use a healthy dose of humility every now and then as well.
I want to take that concept of Dunning-Kruger and overconfidence and thinking you know more than you actually do and talk about that sort of transition from realizing that you are not the person to do this work. It's time to grow the team. I need to find people that can help me and plug those holes, fill those gaps where I can help lead a thing or whatever, but I'm not going to be the one to go execute on that. So I want to talk about the importance of, you mentioned this earlier, but building the foundations for that future team. And we don't have to get too deep. We could probably talk for hours just about this on its own. But I'm curious, for somebody who is thinking about taking a founding designer role, that's a huge aspect of it. It's more than just to take on that on, knowing when to delegate. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts there. I don't have a specific question, but just maybe experience that you've had figuring that out when it's time. Sometimes it could just be, we've got too much work, I got to bring more people on. But how do you know when it's time to start doing that?
Great question. And once again, I won't claim to have the exact right answer, but let's jump in. Let's explore it together. Yeah. I'm in the middle of this right now, by the way. So on my current team at Stable, I just hired a second designer a few months ago. He's ramping up and doing great. And I'll need to hire a couple more designers this year. One of those may actually end up being a brand designer as well. So we're getting into the multidisciplinary aspect of that. I also have it on my radar trying to figure out when the right time is for a researcher, or if it's now, right? Should I swap headcount? It's this game of chess, right? And trying to figure out. And I think ultimately there are two things that I think are inputs into that equation for me. One is attempting to always monitor the health of the design practice within the business. And I should say the product building practice, and figure out where there might be deficiencies there. So where are we feeling the most pain? Where are we falling down? Where's the lowest quality work happening and across the design pipeline, if you will, if we were to treat that linearly? And that can tell a story as well, right? And then the second input is trying to map out the future a little bit and what the ideal state of my team is going to be in 6 months, in 1 year, and 5 years, and build toward that. And trying to balance those two things, like future state and current state, and figure out, right, like you mentioned, what holes do I need to plug now and where do I eventually want to end up? And then spend my capital, if you will, spend my headcount that way to help me get there. So I guess this has been a long-winded way to say, if we're talking about current state, it's probably monitoring the health of what's going on, like boots on the ground, and where we might be falling down, where we're not as successful, where we might not be spending as much time, and trying to staff up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. What I think about, and what I'm hearing you say too, is the idea that you've got to be a really great designer, generalist. You mentioned helping with brand and things like that early on because you're the only person to do it. And at some point, that's going to make you really successful. Then you've got to pivot to that leadership role, that more maybe managerial role. And I often think of the phrase like, what got you here won't get you there. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, as a founding designer, it's one of those things like we're not taught any of this stuff in design school, right? We're never taught about how to be a manager. Managers, regardless of their background, whether they're product managers, engineers, taught how to be engineers, they're taught how to be product managers. No one's ever taught how to be a manager. And I'd love to hear your experience. I know you're not the only person to give advice here, but your experience, like what happened when you transitioned from that design role to that more managerial role? How did you feel about that? Were you happy with that? Is that something you like, or is it just something that you need to be aware of? If you want to be the founding designer, that design part is only half the job. At some point, you're going to have to move into that role and be aware of it. What advice do you have for people in that position?
Great question. And I strongly agree with the idea that the best individual contributors do not always make the best leaders. There are times when that's a good transition. There are times when it's not. And that it's a big problem in the industry that we often look for high-performing ICs and then pluck them out and move them into the manager track. Because as you described, what got them to be a high-performing IC does not always transfer to the manager track. And so that's a problem, and I think it requires the reflection of each designer. I think it also has a lot to do with what growth paths the industry has open at that point and what the business has available for them and ultimately what that person needs. However, if we set aside just like titles and compensation and we just talk about the actual work being done, I do think there is an escape hatch for a founding designer who's growing a team that way, where at least currently I would feel comfortable spinning up the first few designers, establishing a strong design practice, and then essentially moving myself over into a lead role and hiring someone above me, right? And saying, this is my ceiling. I want to keep building, right? I've still got some gas left in the tank. And so let's bring in like a director or a head of or a VP or whatever level we need. and let that person do the manager part of it. And I'm okay giving that up, and I just want to go build now. I would feel comfortable doing that. And ultimately, I experienced some of that at the first startup I was at that I mentioned. It grew very quickly. Within 5 years, I was managing like a team of 7 on a team of 25 designers in an organization of over 600 people. Incidentally, COVID hit at exactly the same time. And I burned out just really hard. My whole day was just like performance reviews and slide decks and spreadsheets. And I wasn't designing anymore. And I took a step back and realized I had 30 something years left in my career and that I still wanted to keep building shit. You know? Like I still wanted to be in the weeds and making things. So the founding designer was actually a way for me to escape that a little bit and move into, this is a kind of a new term we can introduce into the conversation, where I've been in the player coach space now for the past 7 or 8 years. And that's been a way for me to have my cake and eat it too, and play to both roles, which can be tough. But I think ultimately what I'm trying to express is that it's not such a simple cut and dry option. I think there are lots of different flavors of that a person could experience.
I love the idea of a player coach too. I worked at that multinational conglomerate we talked about before, and they were very strict how managers worked. Managers did not do the work. Managers hired leads, UX leads or engineering leads. Managers managed the people. They managed the resources, the butts in the seats. And you had team leads that were not managers, but they were over the work. And so you had dotted lines and solid lines. I don't know. The people that I knew working as managers hated it because they didn't get to do the stuff they really enjoyed. And that idea of player coach, that's exactly how I'm working now. As I'm a manager, I've got a team, but I'm also doing the work, and I'm involved with the work and the design critiques and all that stuff. And even sometimes I'll get into Figma and wireframe stuff. And I enjoy that. I love that. You said a little bit ago, and I think I want to call this out, having the emotional intelligence, right, and the emotional maturity, say, I'm not the person for this job. I'm going to hire someone to actually manage me. You don't have to have 20 years of experience. That's just something, and I don't know, I want to talk a little bit about how you find that emotional intelligence, because as a leader, you need that emotional intelligence to be successful. And it's funny because there's people that have 10, 15 years of experience that still don't have that emotional intelligence and then emotional maturity. And I'm just curious, like for you personally, how did you find that? Was there something in your life that kind of helped you get that point? Because again, this is not something you're ever taught in school. That sort of idea of I need just to let go and find someone to do this. How'd you get there? What was that like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I recognize that when I say this, I'm speaking from a place of great privilege. I want to be very upfront about that. But honestly, something that I think really helped me free myself from that was escaping kind of the corporate ladder mindset and getting myself out of the hustle culture kind of rat race side of things, where those first few years, like every new designer has that hunger, right? You want that senior title and you want it bad, and you will do just about anything to have it. And I definitely experienced that, right? And it was a race to the top. I was doing everything I could to be the highest performer and title chasing for sure. I wanted the influence. Eventually, through several personal life events and also employment events, I recognized that essentially, as long as I was making the income I wanted to be able to live my life with my family, I didn't have to define my value by my work and by my employment. Certainly, as designers, we all inherit a little bit of that design identity. We feel like creative people and we love to make things from nothing. And that can certainly be part of our identity. But when it becomes our entire identity, then all of our value is wrapped up in that title and in that role. And it becomes really hard to separate yourself from that. And can feel very devastating if there's loss of a job or trouble in the job market or title changes or things like that. And by essentially now being able to look at things and say, I'm living very comfortably, I feel very happy, like I'm happy with the track I'm on, and I don't need to continue reaching for the next title and continue chasing the next thing, allowed me to step out of that a little bit. And certainly that's something that I still actually think and read about a lot, and this is very much part of my kind of daily life. That was a way for me to release the pressure on that quite a bit and let that go.
Yeah. For me personally, COVID, I got laid off. Before then, I was UX lead, had a big team, designers in Europe and the US, and giant engineering team traveling all over the place, getting to visit shops and talk to users and things like that, doing a lot of research. It was an awesome job. I think that was like peak career for me, to be perfectly honest. And I got laid off. And that was when I had that, like, I was like, oh, I'm the UX lead. I'm so important. I'm helping make all these decisions, and multi-million-dollar budgets are passing through me and blah, blah, blah. And I felt important. I just went away. And then I'm just like, shit, what the hell? What do I do now? I'm not important anymore. And I don't know. I also think that helped a lot for me, like separating myself from the work and from the titles especially. But I also think, and I don't want to say this implying you have to have kids or a family or anything to feel this way, but I feel personally having kids made me realize that job wasn't nearly as important as a lot of other things. And certainly anyone out there who does not want to have kids, I am not saying you have to have kids to feel this way, for sure. But for me personally, having kids made me realize I just want to make enough money to go do cool stuff with my kids and enjoy life. Call me freaking garbage man. I don't care. If I'm making enough to do the stuff I want to do, I don't care what my title is. Call me what you want. Pay me what I'm worth is what I always say. And I don't know. For me, that helped a lot. It's like you said, realizing spending time with family and stuff was more important.
If anybody listening, vibing with this topic that we're on right now, one of the books that really broke this open for me was the book 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. It has become absolutely one of my favorite books of all time. And at this point, I read it almost yearly, if not more often. It's like on repeat as an audiobook for me. Oh. That is essentially figuring out how to do what matters with the limited time we have is essentially the idea. We're getting existential here. But the point is that things like that can help you self-reflect and can help you separate yourself from the identity crisis of being an early designer or an inflated title designer or whatever you might be. And kids are certainly one way to do it. And there are many other things in life that are valuable as well. You're not just your work. You're a lot more than that. But work can be a great outlet and sense of fulfillment too. And hopefully we can find a way to bring all the designers together so that we can all experience that.
I love it. All right, so I want to shift the gears a little bit and talk about this other thing you mentioned a little while ago about being the source of wisdom's design evangelist, helping spread. Because most of the time, these companies are engineering-led a lot of times, or maybe product-led, and you have to come in. They might not understand design or UX or whatever it is, and you've got to help spread the word and make it better, build that team, things like that. A little bit about emotional intelligence and that idea that this is something that you don't necessarily have to have a lot of experience to do, but wisdom usually comes with experience. I want to talk a little bit, like, from your perspective, getting to that point to realize, hey, I don't need to just design cool stuff. It doesn't speak for itself, those designs. I need to actually evangelize what I'm doing and help spread the practice and improve our maturity, whatever you want to call it. How'd you get to that point? And was there some journey there for you to realize I've got to evangelize this stuff because the work does not speak for itself?
The industry has had a lot of chatter about the idea of design maturity. And I think there are varying levels of utility in those conversations. However, we can definitely all agree that design maturity is a thing. It's how much understanding a team has of design and how it's done well and how to utilize it. And to be honest, this journey starts for me the moment I meet the founders or the hiring manager, whoever that might be at that point. And I'm able to get a sense of what they're looking for and what they need throughout the hiring process. And there are lots of kind of phrases and ideas to listen for that will tell you how they actually view the role of a designer. Specifically, if you hear them say things like, we want you to come in and tell us how to do this right. Green lights across the board, right? Fireworks are going off at that point. You're just so pumped because someone wants to hand over the reins and let you steer. And you might also hear other things that might have the opposite effect of that, right? It might be like, we want you to come in and make really cool, sexy UX UI, right? And at this point, we're dropping buzzwords, right? And we're starting to lose the thread a little bit. And so I've got in the back of my mind, okay, I can tell you don't know exactly what you're talking about, but how open are you to exploring new ideas and trying things a different way, right? So that's going to be a part of the conversation for me from the moment we make first contact. And getting into the business, there's a lot of exploration to be done about who your allies are, who's already bought into this mentality, who's hungry for it, who's not, who's willing to help you spend resources and things like that. And so I think learning, really for better or for worse, I think I picked up some of that by just hopping between a few different companies. And some of those were from culture fit issues, some of those were from funding issues, but having bounced around to a few different places, seeing different working styles, seeing different people was a way to build up that bank of experience, or to build up some of those examples where there are different playbooks to deploy at that point, by understanding and recognizing what the business needs, how you're going to deliver that. So I guess my answer to that question would be something along the lines of gathered experience along the way. And also, we talked a little bit about the idea of process improvement, but you've always got those monitors and probes out trying to listen for what could be better or what's failing and where to spend your time. And then being willing to do that, even if it's not sitting in Figma building UI, but you're actually willing to go to bat for the other softer parts of that process.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, a lot of people will say, maybe recruiters or something will say, hopping around looks bad sometimes, depending on how long you stay. But I think it's also important to have that experience, to know how this thing worked in this context, but maybe it didn't work in this other context. Or this team did something really good, this team did something really bad. I don't ever want to redo what they did, right? So I'm going to avoid doing that again. These are things that you could read books, you could read articles, you could watch videos or something. But if you're not moving around and having experience, and again, I think this goes back to that idea of those junior designers just out of school, or maybe 1 year of working with one company, you're going to have some experience, but do you have that wisdom to know and that intuition to know, I don't think this thing is going to work. This is probably going to be a giant waste of money. I don't think we should do this. I think we need to hire this person, not that person, or build this thing and not that thing. And I think what you mentioned about hopping around, getting that experience, to me is just so important to know. How do you lead a team? How do you become a design founder? How do you influence those stakeholders, those executives, the CEOs, the founders, whatever, if you don't really know from your own experience? You're going to have a hard time convincing them. It doesn't matter how good of a quote-unquote storyteller you are. If you don't have that experience, I think you're going to have a hard time. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but
I will say that I could think of a few notable exceptions to this rule, right? And
Okay.
so it might be worth us trying to break down how that happened and how they were able to get around this. I'm thinking specifically of Julie Zuo of early Facebook days, right? One of the early design hires, became VP of design there and is now doing her own solo thing. Very well known in the space. The other one that comes to mind is, I think she just recently stepped down as VP of design at Mercury. And that was pretty much like her first design job, as far as I remember. And Mercury is now a very successful fintech banking SaaS platform. Mm-hmm. And she went in early, fairly inexperienced designer. Within 7 years, grew to VP with a team of 40 and was very successful there. And so clearly, there's some sort of formula here that works. I think what we're getting at here is, you're really rolling the dice here. I don't know exactly what superpower they had, and we could probably explore what that was. I would assume that there was a fair amount of humility there and willingness to learn, and probably doing research, finding advisors and mentors, finding playbooks to deploy to make things work, because just doing that on a whim and coming out the other side with a healthy, successful, large and growing design team at a successful company is like a 1 in a million chance. But we have examples of it happening. So I think there's some quality or skill set there that makes that possible. And I guess we might have to ask them to figure out what that was.
Yeah, if you know Julie Zoe, tell her holler at me. We'll come on the show and we'll talk about it. So one thing before we get out of here, I want to talk a little bit about just some behavioral traits that you have experienced personally, or maybe seen other people have. But if you're an individual contributor, you've got a few years experience, you think this might be for you, you get an opportunity to become a founding designer somewhere. What are some maybe personality traits or soft skills, whatever you want to call them, behavioral traits that you have identified that make the most successful design founders or founding designers?
That's a great question. And I'm thinking back through some of the things that I was looking for when I was hiring last fall, because essentially I was looking to copy paste myself and bring in another senior designer who had a lot of similar early stage qualities. And so I think some of the things I was looking for were someone who is willing to roll up their sleeves and jump into just about any type of work that the business needs. Essentially, you are a resource to help the business succeed. That is job number one. Help the business be successful. So that means we can't tie ourselves up in dogmatic conversations about what real UX is or things like that, right? It's time to just dig in and make sure the business doesn't die. Every day at an early stage startup is really staving off death until you can get to the next round of funding or move towards profitability. And so we don't really have a leg to stand on if we're going to try and take an ideological stance about, I don't do that, or that's not my role, or something like that. Everybody's got to jump in and help. And so I think there's also some skill there around how to teach yourself and level yourself up when you find yourself in an uncomfortable work stream where maybe you haven't done a lot of that type of work, right? I mentioned I'm a self-taught front-end developer and have built different side projects and sites and things like that. But I came here and we had a Webflow site and there wasn't very clear ownership of that, but like shit needed to happen. And so for a week at night, I would just put on Webflow tutorials on my phone while I washed the dishes. And I was just following along. Okay, all right, we got classes and we got styles. Okay, this is how components work. I see how this is different from Figma. I see how this is different from code. And then next week I was building stuff in Webflow and we were, meeting objectives and outcomes. And that's just what it is. There's this framework or tool or process or thing or industry that I'm not super experienced in, but I'm here to help. The only design resource potentially that we have. So I'm going to make it happen. We're going to figure out a way to be successful. And that needs to be something that's not draining to you, but exciting to you. You're looking forward to learning those new things and jumping into that new stuff.
I love it. All right, Taylor, so we've had you for a little while now, and before we get out of here, I have got a few questions I'd like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. But before we do that, any closing thoughts, anything we didn't get a chance to talk about that you would like all those individual contributors out there that are thinking about taking on this founding designer role, what would you tell them?
I think that this space is going to look a lot different in the next 3 to 5 years. I think we all know that. And so everything that we just described about a founding designer may be totally different. And that's okay. And we'll reconnect and we'll hash it out again.
All right. We'll have you back on as a follow-up when the AI overlords take over and everyone loses their job to robots. We will have you back on and we'll talk about it. All right. Awesome. Let me pull up these questions real quick. Taylor, I got a few questions to ask just to help our listeners get to know you a little bit better. First thing that comes to your mind, you don't have to think too hard about it. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. First up, what is your favorite non-design book?
The one that I mentioned earlier, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals.
I love it. Yeah, so I've never heard of that book, but I assume, what is that, 40,000 divided by 52? That's probably all the years you have in your life, I assume? All the weeks you have?
4,000, I think, is how many weeks you would have if you lived till 80 or something like that.
All right, yeah. Well, that's crazy to think about, by the way. Like,
it's not that many.
Finite number on that. Like, how many have I already lived? I don't even want to do the math. Yeah, that's nuts. Man, I haven't heard of that book, but 4,000, not 40,000. 40,000 would be a long time.
That would.
I have to check that out. I'm scared to read it, to be perfectly honest.
If you
my own mortality.
If you tap into like Eastern philosophy and some of that stuff, there's a lot of benefits that come from actually facing that down and being willing to stare that fear down and then live intentionally and enjoy the ones you got. Oh, non-design. That's tricky. I'm going to try and do this without pulling out my phone. But I really love daily podcasts. And so that's part of my morning routine is just flipping on like a 15, 20-minute daily podcast. One of those recently has been History Daily, where they go through historical events that happened on that same day. So it could be thousands of years ago, like Fall of Rome type stuff, or it could be dozens of years ago, civil rights movement, but just exploring what happened on that calendar day. A lot of fun.
You mentioned watching YouTube while you wash the dishes. That's my time for podcasts. It drives my wife crazy. I've got like the earbud in my ear. She's like, asking me something like, what? Huh? I got the water running, like she's, take the damn thing out of here. No, I'm a big history podcast guy as well. I've been listening to I've got about like another 20 or 30 episodes left before I catch up, but the history of English, which is really fascinating.
All right.
How English came about. And I'm always like little things my wife and my kids are like, I don't care. Do you know where that word came from? Like, can you just shut up? I don't care. That's the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life. All right, next up, what is your favorite meal?
Oh, my favorite meal. You know what? I really love a good stew. And maybe I'm saying that because it's currently -1 degrees outside Fahrenheit where I live. But man, there's something so like warm and cozy about a stew, and you got the carrots and the potatoes and everything, and it's like good for your soul food.
I tell you what, dude, I'm a huge fan of the Pioneer Woman on Food Network, all her recipes. Dude, she has got a stew recipe that is awesome.
Nice.
Check it out.
I'll do it.
It uses like a can of just like Budweiser beer or something like that. But it's like
Right.
you could throw something like a Bach or Shiner or something in there, and that looks really good. But check that recipe out. That was like one of my favorites. My wife, she's a big stew fan. She likes stew as well, and she's a big fan of that one. Pioneer also has a chicken stew. That's really good. It's like white chicken stew. It's got like cream and stuff in it. Man,
Yeah,
so
like a
good.
white chicken chili kind of thing. Nice.
Kind of,
Okay.
yeah. But it's got like potatoes and all. But yeah, it's pretty damn good. I'm a stew fan. I like stew myself. You are in Minnesota. It is -1 now.
Yep, that's
Still?
right.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, I'm in Cincinnati, outside of Cincinnati, and we were in like -6. I can't imagine what it was for you guys up there.
Yeah, we got down. -20 was our lowest.
No way. Oh my God, no way.
But we're getting through it.
All right, man. I don't know. Dude, I don't know how you do it. I'm originally from New Orleans. It barely ever got down below like 32. If it got down to 32, everyone was like, the city shut down.
Yeah, so I'm originally from
so I'm not
Houston,
used to that.
so just a
Yeah,
few hours
okay.
west of you.
So
So this is not my native climate.
Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about because Houston and New Orleans, very similar, humid, funky, hot.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. How do you do that? I don't know, man. Cincinnati's about as far north as I could go.
You go where the family goes, and you figure out how to survive.
That's true, man. That's the emotional intelligence we talked about. All right, next up, what is your favorite vacation spot?
Oh, you know what? I have not done nearly as much traveling as I would like to. We mentioned having kids. That's a big part of that.
3, that's expensive.
So it's hard to say favorite spot, but I can tell you somewhere I'd like to go back. I actually lived in Costa Rica for a couple of years in my early 20s.
Wow.
And
That's awesome.
so I actually haven't been back, but I learned Spanish while I lived there and grew to love the food and a lot of stuff there. And like some of the most incredible beaches you can find.
Yeah.
So I definitely head back there.
I love it. My wife and I went there for our honeymoon, and we keep talking about going back. And it was like so cheap once you get there. Paying for the tickets was expensive, but once you got there, this was like 15 years ago. I don't know what it's probably. I'm sure everything's more expensive now, but man, the beaches, we did the hot springs. We went down to Manuel Antonio. We stayed in this cloud forest up in the mountains. Like at night, the clouds came through, and you're like, "Oh, it's foggy." You're like, "No, these are the clouds. We're so high up." Anyway, man, I miss Costa Rica a lot, dude. I would totally move there in a heartbeat if I could. But yeah, looking at my kids down there now, man, I'm just like, I don't know if I want to deal with that. Wait till they're older. I go by myself, go with my wife, and leave the kids at home. All right, next up, what is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
Oh boy, favorite design tool. And you're asking the guy who did the tool survey
I know,
for
you got a
6
lot.
years. I mean, my go-to is, I'll give you 2 answers here. I might be cheating. My go-to is Notion for just organizing my brain. Yep. And so I'm a longtime Notion user, have personal databases of all the books I've read and all the video games I've played and broken down by category and rating and all that stuff. However, the other thing I'm exploring right now, so certainly not favorite because it's emergent, but just figuring out all the ways AI can plug into the design pipeline and just like really staring down how much this role is going to change. And seeing that happen every day. It hasn't settled down enough, but trying to stay ahead of that and make sure me and my team are ready for that. And there's a lot there. Currently looking at Subframe, Builder.io, Lovable, V0, Bolt, all this stuff. There's too many right now. It's kind of like prototyping in 2015, right? There was like 30 prototyping tools that all came out within 2 years of each other. But in the AI space, especially for coding and design. So we got to wait for a winner to emerge here before we invest too deeply. But there's a lot to be done there.
So this could be an entire episode on its own, but I'm curious, do you have a prediction on which tool will win out? And second, if you said you're staring this AI stuff, like staring down the barrel of the AI cannon, not even a gun, it's like a cannon. What is your prediction there on the future of our job in the last 5 minutes that we have?
Oh yeah, here we go.
Can you answer that? Yeah.
Should we speed run
Lightning
this?
round, let's go.
All right, here we go. My prediction for the industry or the role as a whole, I would be happy to be wrong. My current hypothesis is that engineers, product managers, and designers will flatten into a single technologist role, who is a person who can do like business analysis and then go build a thing that directly delivers a solution. And that those people can come from all 3 of those backgrounds. Then your other question, remind me the second question, was it tools?
Just out of all, like you mentioned, there's 50 tools. Which you have one that you think is going to be the winner? It's going to be the next Figma.
Yeah, so there's definitely far too many like chatbot to code tools. And in many ways that can just be a novelty. And if we develop strong enough global LLMs, the DeepSeeks and the OpenAIs of the world, then they'll be able to just do a lot of that themselves. I think if a player has a large enough user base and can pivot into that space quickly enough, like right now, I think if Figma could deliver a lot of what we're seeing from some of these other AI solutions, that they would continue to dominate. However, someone might come take their lunch money if they don't deliver quick enough, because their last swing at AI last year was pretty pitiful. And so they've really got to come back on top. So I'm not sure, but I'd like to see them capture the space, because everybody could just stay where they are.
For sure. Do you have any insights or your prediction? You mentioned something about someone coming to take Figma's lunch, but do you think Figma's setting themselves up to be the next InVision or Sketch?
Oof, it would be painful for them to be the next InVision, especially after the failed Adobe acquisition. That would just be the worst story arc for them. Oh, man. Like, one of the ones I've been particularly interested in, both Builder.io and Subframe are building underneath the hood with React components and then have a layer of AI on top of them. And I could see that being a really strong contender. But it's really that whole adoption curve of getting a strong enough user base so that you could actually pull enough people away from Figma. And that's not an easy job.
Yeah, especially now that Figma has become the enterprise tool. For the longest time, I could tell you, like, my job, like for my last job, at least when I was working at the big company, we were stuck with Sketch for just like 5 extra years, longer than most teams, because we just had the license and we had the contracts worked out and everything else. And I imagine there's a lot of companies might even still be using Sketch. Nobody wants to talk about it, but I'm willing to bet there's still a lot of companies out there using Sketch for that very reason.
Yeah, so we talk about founding designer, small team, early role. Your team is small enough that you can pretty quickly hop and skip between tools, because you don't have 50 designers invested in one tool, right? And so it's a little easier to uproot and move. So I'd love to see something like that happen while we're still small. It'll be a lot harder 5 years down the road.
Yeah, especially like the legacy files and just the stuff you've got from years ago and everything else, and all your design systems built into one tool, and having to migrate that to another tool. Jesus, it's like a monumental effort, especially when you've got like a team of 50 plus designers in an enterprise environment. But all right, dude. Taylor, this has been an amazing conversation. I was so excited to have you on. Before we get out of here, give yourself a plug. Let everybody know where they can find you. Tell us what you got going on right now and where they can find you, follow you online, and all that stuff.
Yeah, the place I'm probably most active would be on LinkedIn. You can find me at my personal site, taylorpalmer.io. And I also occasionally write at startupdesigndiaries.substack.com.
Right on. Taylor, this has been amazing conversation. I learned a lot. I think hopefully a lot of people it will help them influence their decision on whether or not they want to take that founding designer role. It's a hard job, demanding job, but it is seems like a really cool job for the right person. Taylor, thanks again. Really appreciate it, man.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.